Thank you, and thank you all. It's a delight to be back with you, and to it's always an honor to be asked, and a miracle to be asked back. So it's nice to participate in that. We're gonna some of you I know may not have been here last time. The basis of what we're doing is a book that I've been working on. It's off to the publisher now. That the title of it is Biblical Fracking, Midrash for Modern Christians. And the Midrash is a Jewish practice that's been around for 2,500 years, of going beyond the text. That you read a biblical text and then you take off on a tangent that the text suggests. The oldest form of that was the question, why didn't Adam talk Eve out of eating the apple? That was, so that's the kind of thing it does. So Midrash is a Jewish practice, and I'm not Jewish, and so Midrash comes from that tradition. I'm not in that tradition, so we had to get a new name, and so the name that I chose is Biblical Fracking, which is doomed not to catch on, but it's all right. It means that in the same way that geological fracking is getting treasures out of the cracks and seams of the earth, biblical fracking is getting treasure out of the cracks and seams of the Bible. And that's what we'll do. In both cases, both are very rewarding, but they're also very dangerous because you can abuse it. There's nothing to tell you as you'll hear as we go in here, and his relationship with his brothers. And the third is about St. Paul and his sister. And most people don't know he has a sister, but he did, and I'll tell you how that works when we get there. But I want to go through those three stories, then we'll open it up and talk together and see what we're going to do, and then be on our way and go to church and enjoy springtime and all the rest. So, in the 22nd chapter of Genesis, there is a great and powerful story, which is the sacrifice of Isaac. And you may remember that God had promised Abraham that he would have a son, and that son was very late in coming, and Abraham was worried about that. But they had a son finally, and they gave him the name Isaac, which means laughter. They were just so giddy and pleased about that. And then comes this very strange scene when God says, all right, Abraham, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. Child sacrifice. I want you to sacrifice Isaac. Now, all of us here who have children know that there's something to be said for child sacrifice, but that's not the road we're going down right now. The fact is that so what happened is that it is a great story, a very dramatically told story, a very powerful story about the testing of Abraham's faith. And it's observed not only in Jewish and Christian practices and traditions, but also in Islam. In Eid al-Adha is the Feast of the Sacrifice, comes in August, and that's a thing that they do. So it's a big part of our Abrahamic religions, and it's about Abraham's faith. So that's the center of the story, and rightly so, and that's the proper focus. But fracking never quite stays with the proper focus. So we're going to look at the edges of the story, and what we're going to look at is the relationship between Abraham and Sarah the night before the sacrifice. Okay? Now, in this setting, Abraham is the patriarch. There's no question about it. He makes decisions, he makes them by himself, and that's up to him. So there's no question about his right and ability to do this. But on the other hand, as you look at the story of Abraham and Sarah, Sarah is persuasive. Sarah is also a fierce protector of her son Isaac. So in one story, as they were not having children and going along, Sarah gave Abraham her servant Hagar. Now, there's a whole other story about how Hagar might have felt about that, but we're not going there. Gave her servant Hagar to Abraham, and Abraham was to have a child with with a servant. And that's sort of surrogate parenting, kind of out of fashion these days, as I recall, but that was the custom then. And so Hagar has a child. The child is named Ishmael, and in Islam, Ishmael is the founder of their line of this religion, and so in their telling of the story, it's the sacrifice of Ishmael. But for our purposes, we are Judeo-Christian tradition, so we remember it as Isaac. But what happened in the story about Ishmael is that Sarah noticed that Ishmael, once Isaac was born, she became aware that Ishmael was kind of crowding him a little bit. He's older, brother. He's older and all that kind of stuff. So Sarah convinces Abraham, very much against his will, to send Hagar and her child away. Now, this is rough stuff in a family. I mean, this is tough to do. But to drive them away. Now, what that tells us for our purposes in understanding this story is that Sarah is a fierce protector of her son. And she is not without substantial influence in the decision-making process that Abraham has. So, the question comes up, where was Sarah's protective instincts as they prepared to sacrifice her only son, Isaac? What happened? All right, now here we are, we're fracking now, we're out there, there's nothing to tell us, but I want to suggest that she didn't say anything because Abraham didn't tell her. I think that Abraham did not tell her because he knew what he'd get. And so he chose silence. Abraham was faced with a terrible, terrible moral dilemma. If he turned his back on God, who was telling him to make this sacrifice, he would make a lie of everything that he ever had been, all that he is, all that he ever would be. But if he sacrificed his own son, quite apart from the incredible emotional turmoil of that, he would cut himself off from the promise that had motivated him for his whole life. Now, I would suggest that we here in this room would have no trouble making that decision. Do I sacrifice my son or do I obey this word from God? I think we'd make it really quick. The only person who might make it faster than you and me would be Sarah. She would know in a heartbeat, half a heartbeat, that no way are we going to sacrifice our son Isaac. So Abraham chose God, and he did not tell Sarah. So now what happens the night before? Now Abraham and Sarah have been together for a long time, and Sarah knows that something is absent. Sarah knows that something is going on and there's no story. Now, why didn't she ask? Because what she would have gotten would be hot, angry denial. And so she backed off. And Sarah chose silence, just as Abraham chose silence. And then in that tent, the night before, the great demon is silence itself. The powerful demon, when everybody in the room knows that there's something that needs to be said, and nobody says it. So what's it like the next morning when Abraham takes Isaac and leaves? Silence. Silence tears them apart. Was there eye contact? Was there a touch? Was there even a physical acknowledgement that this is very hard for both of us? Both of them, I think, behaved as if nothing were wrong, even though both of them knew that something very terrible was wrong. Abraham knew its name, Sarah did not. I think that Sarah did the dishes, Abraham loaded the donkey, and they avoided one another. They did so because unnamed fears are the worst. Foreboding and dread in the darkness of silence is something that's very, very hard to face. And I think they walked off without speaking. And afterward, as you know, the story is that Abraham took the child up on the mountain, and there's a very dramatic telling of that story, and then God provides a ram, and then the sacrifice of Isaac is not necessary, showing that God requires the faith of that kind of faith, but not that kind of action. And that's what the story goes on to say. And so it comes with the saying that I've faced some terrible things in my time, and most of them never happened. And that's what happens with Abraham. But then he comes home. He comes home. And I don't think he can tell Sarah what happened. I don't think he can tell her the story. Because if he does, the whole tale would be brought back to the preceding night. Why didn't you tell me? And I think that he didn't tell her. And I think that they chose silence. And basically what they did is that they chose a lack of trust in one another. Now, the word love is not used at all in terms of relationships at this time in our history. But in our day and time, when we promise in the marriage ceremony to love one another, what that promise is commitment. It's not to have a certain set of feelings. It is to make a commitment. And on the strength of that commitment, all of the feelings that we have between us can go back and forth on the strength of that commitment and bond between us. That's what it means to love one another in the marriage ceremony way. Abraham and Sarah looked at the commitment between them and they said, that bridge is too weak to carry this weight. And they chose silence. And I think familiarity in the community prevented any deeds of power and led him to opine, prophets are not without honor except in their own country and in their own house. And many, many centuries later, an editor and critic, Eric Larrabee, wrote these words, the prophet is without honor in his own country precisely because his own countrymen have to listen to him all the time. And that's, so that's what we've got here. So the picture I want to look with you, it's always a little dicey to take on the Holy Family. I mean, I have to admit that, one should approach this with a certain amount of fear and trembling. But Jesus at home as a child. Jesus is clearly precocious. It's a great story in Luke's gospel about how Joseph and Mary had gone into Jerusalem for the Passover. And they're traveling with their whole community, their whole town there, and everybody together. And so you're not really looking after, it's kind of like when you're at Shrine Month, you don't look after the kids all the time. Everybody's looking after the kids. So you're moving along, and that's fine. And they're on their way home, and they travel a whole day, and then they realize that Jesus didn't come with them. So then they go back into Jerusalem and they look for him for 3 days. Now, can you imagine the anxiety that you're going to have building up in you? 3 days in a big place like Jerusalem, relatively big, a big place like Jerusalem, and they can't find this kid for 3 days. And they finally come on to him and they find him in the temple. And the story in Luke's gospel, son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Why were you searching for me? He asked. Didn't you know that I had to be in my father's house? But they did not understand what he was saying to them. I think that raises another possibility of child sacrifice in the thing. I'd have killed one of mine at that point if I got that kind of an answer from him. But obviously this is a precocious child. And another insight into the family life there of Jesus, the famous story of the wedding feast at Cana. And you remember that they all go to this wedding reception, really, and they run out of wine. And so Mary says, Jesus, you fix it. And he says, I don't want to do that. And she says, so she really backs him into a corner and turns around, quits talking to him, and says to the servants, do whatever he tells you, and walks off. There he is. My question is, how does she know he could do anything? I don't think that the family of Mary and Joseph have been to Total Wines in years. I think he's been making wine at home for a long time, and that's how they know. I mean, that's what are you going to do? I mean, that's it. You know, I think it's possible that the feeding miracles, I think they were field tested in Mary's kitchen. I think that there was some of this going on at home there with that. And if you think, well, that's not very nice to think that Jesus would do that sort of thing. There is a public record of Jesus and what I call a convenience miracle. And it's when he was walking on water. And this is an account in Mark's gospel. And it says that of course, the disciples went out in the boat, and then Jesus comes walking along, scared the bejabbers out of the disciples, as well it might. And it says in there that Mark 6:48, that Jesus intended to pass them by. Okay, now that means that he didn't plan for them to see him walking on water. Then why was he walking on water? Because it was a shortcut over to the other side. That's what it was. That's the only possible explanation. So there you are, the possibility of convenience miracles by Jesus. And the thing is that, I think that the home life of Jesus, with Jesus, would have had some of those experiences in it. As I said, how else would Mary know that he could do anything about the water and wine situation at Cana? Now, that might have been a boon to the family, but my particular focus in this little bit is about Jesus's brothers. Jesus's brothers. Now, the brothers are named James, Joseph, Jude, Simon, and then sisters. I'm sorry, ladies, but the sisters were just sort of glommed together, and we don't know who they are or where they were. But so we're going to focus on the brothers, because that was the power base that people were working from, and that was that's where the power was. And so I think that Jesus was a boon to the family. I think he was a pain in the neck to his brothers, an absolute pain in the neck. Now, children, of course, are tiny eddies of self-interest in life, and they view all things through themselves, which means that James, Joseph, Jude, and Simon would have viewed Jesus not as Jesus, but as an extension of themselves. What's that got to do with my life right now? Now, there's a question here about where Jesus fits in the family. And was he the firstborn or was he the lastborn? Now, this, it seems strange to me, but this really has to do with what you think about Mary's sex life. That if one theory is that he got brothers because Joseph was older, had been married before, and that makes Jesus the youngest brother. Or you follow a slightly more logical path, which is that that Jesus was the oldest and the others were born later. Now, there are people for whom the virginity of Mary becomes very important, and I'm not in that camp, but I make no case against that. And so it depends on whether you see Jesus is going to be either the oldest brother or the youngest brother. So and at this point, most people think that Joseph was older than Mary and died not too long after the trip to Jerusalem, where he disappears from the story. So if he's an older brother, if he's the oldest brother, it is natural for children to push against the limits. And Jesus, if Joseph had died, Jesus is the one who is kind of the enforcer of this sort of thing. And with the younger children, with all children, that's their job, is to find out what the limits are. How do you live within these limits? Where are those limits? How do you do that? And the only way to do that is by pushing against those limits. So if he's the oldest brother, the younger brothers were pushing against him all the time. If he's the youngest brother, there is among children a natural hierarchy of age, that the older is meant to outrank the younger, okay? And, that's been true. I think it's true always. And it is absolutely galling to be outshone by someone you outrank. Now, that's true in families and, business and everywhere else. But, that's not so good. So the brothers have a lot of reason to resent Jesus Even if he's the older brother or the younger brother, there's a lot of reason to resent him. As the story goes on and we get into the story of the early church, the only brother who shows up on the other side of the Gospels is James. He's the only one who shows up with the other church. Now, so where were the others? Where were the others? Now, I don't know if you have much experience with small towns. Orrin and I come from small towns about 20 miles apart in West Virginia, Carolyn, Joe, and other places, that we who know that sort of thing. How do small towns deal with problems? Mostly the way Abraham and Sarah did, by whispering, not talking. And Jesus is a problem. Precocious, superstar, everybody talks about him, convicted felon, executed criminal. People in small towns shake their heads, they whisper, they try not to talk about it. It says in John's gospel that Jesus gave his mother, Mary, to the servant John, to the disciple John. Now, why not? Why do that? Well, I don't think she can go back to Nazareth. I don't think she can go back to Nazareth, and I think that's where Joseph, Jude, and Simon and the sisters are. And they're there dealing with a scandal, the way small towns most often deal with scandal, which is to talk about it privately, keep it quiet publicly, and Mary can't show her face in Nazareth anymore, and that's the reason for the exchange. So, C.S. Lewis says that Jesus was either the absolute Messiah and incarnation of God, or a complete madman. And everybody has to decide about that, including James, Joseph, Jude, Simon, and the sisters. And I think that James decided to follow it, and did, and his story is told. I think Joseph, Jude, and Simon, I think they decided maybe he was nuts. And this talk about the resurrection, well, that's Jerusalem. Who knows what goes on down there? Nobody, not very clear about that stuff. And not sure they're going to buy that. So I think that Joseph, Jude, and Simon, and perhaps the sisters, stayed in Nazareth, and like Abraham and Sarah, kept quiet about the whole thing. Third story, Paul's sister. Bet you didn't know that Paul had a sister. Well, aren't you glad you came this morning? See? In the 23rd chapter of the book of Acts, after Paul and the telling of the story has been active for a long time and doing all sorts of stuff and things like, he's out there and he's in trouble everywhere he goes, and he comes back to Jerusalem and he gets in trouble again, and he's in more trouble, and there's a usual turmoil swirling around him, and so the Romans take Paul into protective custody. Okay, they've taken him off the streets to stop the riot, take him into protective custody. And the 23rd chapter of Acts, in the 16th verse, says, now what happened is that the leaders in Jerusalem are planning to ambush Paul and kill him. Okay, so now it says on this Acts 23:16, now the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. All right. Now, when you're fracking a story, you say, sister? Sister? What would it be like to be Paul's sister? Now, she's not named. This is the only reference to her at all. She's not named. So I gave her one. Her name is Rebecca. You'll be glad to know that. But with Rebecca, there are some things that we know about the family from the writings of St. Paul. And if it's true of Paul, it's true of Rebecca. One is that they came from Tarsus, which is in modern-day Turkey, not not too far from the Mediterranean, but in those days it was a vibrant political center and a commercial city. So, it had some substance to it. They were Roman citizens. Now that's moving up a notch. That's really important there. They were Roman citizens. And that made them certainly part of the social elite of Tarsus and perhaps part of the financial elite of Tarsus. They were a devout family. Paul was a Pharisee. And the Pharisees were the strictest party in Judaism. Now, they've got a bad press from Christians for a long time, but they were really serious guys, and they really did a good job in the world in which they lived. And they were much to be admired, and they were the strictest party. They were quite serious. Another thing to know about them is that they were proud of their heritage. Paul makes a statement in one of his letters that he is of the tribe of Benjamin. And that's very nice to know, but he makes that statement long after the delineation of tribes has ceased to make any difference in terms of identifying people. So, it's kind of like saying, well, our family came over on the Mayflower, or we're first families of Virginia, or something like that. We're a fine old family, kind of a thing. Somebody told me once that the definition of a fine old family is one that used to be better. That's it. But the thing is that Paul has defined himself and defines himself in terms of a tribal connection that's really not operable in the way people are thinking and talking at that time. So I think Rebecca has that too. The other thing is, education is a priority with this family. Now, it wouldn't have been to educate Rebecca, but it was to educate Paul. And so Paul studied under a Pharisee named Gamaliel in Jerusalem, which would have been the equivalent of Ivy League, the good stuff. So those things we know about the family, and from Paul at least, you get the sense that they enjoyed and were comfortable with the privileges that all of this implies. There's an exchange in the 22nd chapter of Acts when the Romans find out that Paul is a Roman citizen. And it says there, the tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" He said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." "I was born a citizen," said Paul. The haughty air of old money to the nouveau riche. Well, we've been members of the club here for a long time, and you'll find your way around. That sort of thing. So you get that sense of inborn privilege there. And then another little piece of it is that Rebecca's son has access to the Roman barracks. Now, this is a Jew. This is a devout Jew. This is a Pharisee's family, or by extension, he has access to the Roman barracks. Just think for a moment, how many Afghan children can come into the green zone in college? Not many. You've got to have some credentials to do that. So he has access, and then he has entree to the commanding officer. Because as the story goes on, he tells his Uncle Paul, they're trying to ambush you, and Paul says, well, go tell the tribune, the commanding officer. So he does. He has access as a young boy. He says a boy, so what do you want to make him, 15, 16, something like that? So he can go to this family's got some credentials someplace. So now what we get a picture is a family, comfortable, successful, well-established, patriotic, and they undoubtedly took a great deal of pride in Paul. A great deal of pride in Paul until he joined that cult that was later on in the book of Acts described as everywhere spoken against. It's as if with all of the privilege and power and presence that one might have where you and I live here and all that sort of thing that we enjoy, and we send a son off to the really good school, and he comes back and announces that he's a Hare Krishna now, and he's going to be out there, with a pigtail jumping up and down. And what are you going to do with that? How would Rebecca and her parents react? Well, whatever their reaction involved, it certainly included self-interest. Now, there may have been other responses, but I can almost guarantee that in the conversation between Rebecca and her parents was, how could he do this to us? How could he embarrass us this way? His behavior endangers our comfortable, successful, well-established, and patriotic life. Now, what's going on there on the wider stage is that Judaism had long before this decided that what God wanted from God's people was purity. And in order to achieve purity, there was a certain amount of separateness and isolation that was involved. And so, in Judaism in the first century, being holier than thou was practically a blood sport, that everybody was separating themselves from the people who were unclean, to say nothing of separating themselves from the unclean Gentiles. Now, the message that Jesus brought was that no, God does not expect isolated purity. God expects engagement. Okay, that's our tradition that we get from Jesus. That's the reason that Orrin ended the service this morning with go into all the world and get going into the world. That's our idea. And that idea was proclaimed by Jesus, but it was made real by Paul on the issue of the inclusion of Gentiles. So it's a profound moment in the development of our faith. And the conversion of St. Paul, the beginning of that story, is a great Christian feast day, January 25th. Caravaggio and others have painted it. It's a very dramatic moment, and it means a lot. But if you keep your eye on Rebecca and her family, for Rebecca and the family, what it introduces for them is a moment of decision. And the decision that they have to make is, did they love Paul, or did they simply love loving Paul? Think about the difference. Did they love Paul, the fact of him, the reality of him, the decisions of him, the life of him, or did they merely love loving Paul? Loving the pride that it gave them, loving the pleasure that it gave them, the bragging rights that it gave them. It was good to see him, and it felt good to see him, and all that kind of stuff, and people spoke well of him. And now he's with this group that is everywhere spoken against. So did they love Paul, or did they merely love loving Paul? Did they love the fact of him and what was inside of him, or did they love what they got from him? Pride and joy. Well, there's no way to know, of course. That's one of the fun things about fracking. But there is a wisp of evidence, the barest wisp of evidence. And that is that in the 22nd chapter of the book of Acts, which is where this story is set, Paul has already done all this stuff. He has gone his conversion, and he's gone here, and he's been thrown in jail, and he's been he's been stoned, and he's been everything like he's been, a center of turmoil for a long time. And at this point in the story, Rebecca and her son are still there. They're still there. They don't disappear like the three brothers of Jesus. They're still there. Late in the game, after Paul's fame and infamy was well established, she's still there. I think that means something, but it's hard to tell. Now, as I said last time, in thinking about Eliezer of Damascus last time, the bad thing about this is that I don't know that I'm right, and the good thing is you don't know that I'm wrong. So that's how we balance that out. Now, I'm going to stop there and see if take your comments, whatever you have, and when you do this, that there has to do with knowing something about the landscape, something about human beings, about people, but you could be as right as I am, or as whatever. Yes, sir.
I think in the wrong hands, fracking could be very dangerous.
Yes, sir, it can. Very much so. Like geological fracking, it can be very badly abused. You're quite right. And the difference, I think that the saving point in our tradition has always been sharing your story with the community. And that's where we hear the balance. That if I had told this story and said that, and therefore, we should all go blow up a mosque or something like that, I think the community would say, no, Frank, you got it wrong. So doing it in community is a safety line, but it doesn't preclude your good point. You're quite right. Right. Yes.
Frank, what do you think Sarah said when she found out at age 90 or whatever she was that she was going to have a kid? That would be my favorite.
Well, I mean that you can go there. It says that in the story. It says that you all hear the question that what did Sarah do when she found out late in life that she was going to have a child, and she had heard the angel tell Abraham that she was going to have a thing, and it says that she was behind the tent listening, and that she laughed. Now, I think it was more like not funny, but kind of that sort of thing. But this, one of the things is that in this world, the value of women was tied almost exclusively to the ability to have children, and semi-exclusively to the ability to have sons. And so that's what they were there for. And with the mortality rate what it was, and the survival, where they lived on the edge of survival, reproducing your family was a very serious thing. So it was not without merit. But I think, and a woman who had no children, as Sarah up to that point, was failing at the essential, business. In the same way that a person in our own day who goes into business and ends up broke, it would just, I didn't go into business to get broke, So I think that there was some joy in her about that. But again, who knows? But they named the child is born. They named laughter. That's what Isaac means. Isaac means laughter. So they were pretty happy about that. So she might have had a martini or two before, but anyway. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think Isaac didn't tell his mother?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question, and I think that did Isaac tell his mother? I think that there are not. Abraham might have been the first, but God knows he's not the last father to be going home with his sons and saying, "Don't tell your mother what we did." I don't know. I mean, there you go. You create a whole nother story, but you go off on that one. Amy, what?
Doesn't the story say, I could be totally wrong, but I kind of got something here, that Isaac didn't return with Abraham?
Isaac did not return?
That he didn't return and he was gone for 3 years.
I do not know that. That is not in my head.
I'll have to look that up.
Okay, fine. I'm.
And so, because someone, according to your biblical practice, said kind of went off to college.
Could it? Yeah, he went off to college, or had his compulsory service, or I don't know what. So there's all kinds of places to go. I am not aware of that piece of information, but it doesn't change too much, but it would solve this problem about him. Joe?
I would just trying to understand, is there any indication how old Isaac is?
There's some indication that ordinarily the paintings and the kind of the mind, but no, but most of the pictures of that make him a fairly young, pre-pubescent age. But
Maybe his dad never even told him when he was young.
it's possible too. I mean, because as you read that story, that he keeps saying, well, gee, where's the animal we're going to sacrifice? God will take care of that. Okay, and then he gets him laid out on the altar, and is ready to kill him when the ram shows up in the thorns over there. So, I mean, you wouldn't have to be brilliant to figure out that you're about to be, but it's really hard to tell. And I think that that the most of the pictures and most of the ideas are that this is a young boy, 10 years old, something like that. But that information isn't in there. So I don't know. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be interesting if Eliezer was the servant that was with them on that journey?
Well, that. We talked about Eliezer last time, which is for those of you who were not here, that Eliezer in Abraham's prayer about his frustration of not having a child born to him says, "And the inheritor of my house will be Eliezer of Damascus, my servant." And and so then when the baby was born, our question last week was, everybody was happy. What happened to Eliezer? Who, if Abraham thought he was going to inherit, so did Eliezer. And what happens to the disappointment? One of the things is, one of the midrash, Jewish midrash, is that it was Eliezer who went and found Rachel for Isaac as a wife. So but that's midrash. I don't know. But yes, you can have him there. You can not have him there. You can, and you can follow his story. But it's only in one of the places where you don't want it when you do this. I think it's kind of important that we're not just at play in the fields of the Lord, and spinning tail, because the purpose is to gain some insight that begins to say something about our own lives. So there's a part of the danger that this gentleman pointed out is to just keep spinning these stories wider and wider, for no purpose. I think the purpose of the enterprise is to learn something, is to gain some insight, and insight into ourselves is more important than insight into Eliezer or Isaac. Yes, excuse me.
I was saying, or for the wrong purpose.
Or for the wrong purpose, indeed. Your own purpose. One of the bedrock principles is that the Bible's like a person. If you torture it long enough, you can get it to say anything you want, and that's there to do, and heaven knows people have done that. Yes, sir.
For the story of Abraham and Isaac and all that, do we have any current expectations on who wrote that? How that story got written down on some parchment and evolved over time? Is there?
Well,
it's been a while since I've been in school, so I don't remember a lot of those details. But if Abraham sat down and go, I got to write it down.
Yeah.
Isaac wrote it down. If Eliezer wrote it down, and somebody else changed it.
Well, for the most part, there are 4 authors of the book around it in there, and I don't frankly remember which one this is, but the author who writes is a long way from the story that was told and the story itself. So you have there was an event of some kind, and then there was an oral tradition, and then somebody wrote it down. If you're just going to put these into the broadest possible understandings of a timeline, the story of Abraham would have been maybe 1700 years before the birth of Christ, and a lot of the writing was apparently done in the 6th century before the birth of Christ. So that's a long time for an oral tradition, but they were better at oral traditions than we are. So it holds some integrity, and so that's a whole separate study. But it's hard to you can't say that that Isaac interviewed on the by the reporter there at the Oaks of Mamre Press. You don't have that. It's an oral tradition, which is the reason that Islam can say with a straight face it was Ishmael. And we can look him in the eye and say it was Isaac. Well, okay, there you are. It's not worth fighting over, but that's a separation there. So you really don't have that kind of material to tell you. Yes, sir.
Has anyone suggested another name for you? So my children are science fiction fans. They've grown up in the world of Harry Potter, and out of that world has spun something called fan fiction.
We talked about that last week. Somebody told me about that. Called it fan fiction. Yeah, and somebody brought that up last week. So yeah.
So I guess it's based on fiction, and
yeah,
you're saying something different.
Right. It is, but it's the same idea. but the main, I think I want to keep emphasizing that the main purpose here is to listen before God to what God might be saying to us about ourselves.
Illuminates.
Yeah, to illuminate somehow, and not, and so that it has that, it wants to go there as opposed to just entertain. I mean, and I have fun with it. I think it's entertaining, but that's not its stopping point. So you want to go a little bit beyond that. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Spinning all this, it's always bothered me that God would order anybody to sacrifice their son. I mean, either they're illegal, they're immoral.
Yes. I mean, I would be. I think we are appalled at that. That's the reason I said that we could make that decision in a heartbeat here. No question about that. It's the same question that our ancestors understood, that God directed them to what you and I now call ethnic cleansing as they crossed the Jordan River, which we think is not a very cool thing to do. And they had slaves, which we don't think is a very cool thing. So there's a lot, they were not God's finished product, but then frankly, neither are we. And so, there is that. In the timing, in the world of this, the many other gods had child sacrifice as an act, as a measure of devotion to the god, and for the most part, the sacrificial system. This is a substantial overstatement. For the most part, that was to appease the gods. That is, to keep the gods off your back, and rather than to accomplish some historic purpose, because the gods weren't really interested in that sort of thing. It was to keep them off your back, and so those faithful sacrifices were that. So it's really hard to go back there, but it's also almost impossible to think of it as a good idea. And part of the story, what the story is meant to tell us is, you're right, God does not require that. That's not what God requires the faith equivalent, but not the act, and that's central to the understanding of that story. But I agree. I mean, these folks are made out of rough cloth, and so there you are. But we'll undoubtedly be. We're already an embarrassment to our grandchildren. So in 3,000 years, who knows how embarrassing we'll be. So I don't know, but you're quite right. It's hard for us to get. All right, where are we? We're about. Yes. Okay. Thank you all very much. Next week, we're going to look at Holy Week. We're going to look at Holy Week and take a really close look at the bad guys, Judas, Caiaphas, and Pilate. Okay? There we go.